morning, everyone. It's great to see you. My name's Alexis Abramson, and I'm Dean of the Climate School at Columbia University. And we're excited to have you here for this panel of really amazing people. A couple of people are running late due to other obligations, and we're just going to kind of keep moving forward as one does at COP. Hopefully they'll be able to join us in a bit. I don't have to tell all of you that climate impacts are accelerating across the globe. And once again, it is emerging economies that are bearing the greatest burden. The devastation we've seen in recent weeks from Hurricane Melissa in the Caribbean is a stark reminder that the cost of inaction is measured not just in dollars, but in lives and livelihoods. According to the UN Environment Programme's Adaptation Gap Report 2025, emerging economies will need roughly $310 billion per year by 2035 to adapt to a warming world. When we base that estimate on the needs already expressed in national plans and commitments, the figure rises to $365 billion annually. And yet, adaptation finance flows to emerging economies totaled just $26 billion in 2023, a fraction of what's required. As Secretary General Antonio Guterres put it, adaptation is not a cost, it is a lifeline. Closing the adaptation gap is how we protect lives, deliver climate justice, and build a safer, more sustainable world. Even with strong progress on emissions reductions, climate impacts will persist. Droughts, floods, food insecurity, and forced migration are already reshaping economies and communities. Adaptation is not an option, it is essential. To meet this challenge, we must take a holistic approach. Public budgets alone cannot close the gap. We need governments, development banks, insurers, private investors, and communities. Adaptation is not optional, it is essential. To meet this challenge, we must take a holistic approach. Public budgets alone cannot close the gap. We need governments, development banks, insurers, and private investors as well. This is about more than finance. It's about rethinking how economies function, moving toward a circular, resource-efficient model that builds resilience, equity, and well-being. It's about investing in capacity building, technology transfer, and anticipatory planning so that societies can prepare, not just react. At the Columbia Climate School, we are deeply committed to this work. We translate frameworks into policy action, research into market-ready technologies, and projects into measurable real-world impact. Through our research centers and our accelerator, we help build partnerships that bridge science and government and the private sector. Our degree, they train the next generation of leaders to connect with data and decisions. And our executive education programs equip professionals around the world with the tools to integrate climate risk and resilience into their strategies. Because the adaptation challenge is not just scientific, it is societal. It demands leadership, collaboration, and the courage to invest in our shared future. If we act together with urgency and imagination, adaptation can truly become the lifeline that the world needs. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. For those watching online, we're not sweating from the heat. We're glistening with optimism for what is to come. My name is Jeff Slegemelch. That's spelled just how it sounds. I wrote my notes, pause for laughter. I guess I was overly optimistic on that one. I'm the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at the Columbia Climate School, also a professor of practice. And you know, we first got engaged in this work through a variety of different avenues. But a recent culmination of this is our Climate Finance Vulnerability Index. And through that index, which was developed with support from our colleagues at the Rockefeller Foundation, really was sort of to take a look at this multi-dimensional problem through multiple dimensions, looking at climate risk, both through the hazard exposure, but also vulnerability and capacity to cope, retrospectively and prospectively, as well as to look at finance, and not just GDP per capita, but things like debt sustainability, financial integration, financial sophistication, the things that would determine if a country could actually access capital to support finance. And one of the key findings we had was that there wasn't really a correlation between hazard exposure and need for climate finance vulnerability. That there were a lot of countries exposed to a lot of hazards that had resources that really developed really great systems to be able to manage it. This may sound counterintuitive, but it reminds us that adaptation is a manageable aspect as we continue to work towards climate mitigation and reducing emissions, if we can create capital and systems available for doing it. So to talk about this multidimensional problem, we have a very multidimensional panel here to go through this. And so going down to my left, first I have Youssef Nassif, who's the Director of Adaptation Division at the UNFCCC. Next to him, we have Avinash Prasad, who is a Special Advisor to the President on Climate Change at the Inter-American Development Bank. We're going to ask you a couple questions up front because I know you have to leave in about 15 minutes. We're joined by Elizabeth Yee, Executive Vice President for the Rockefeller Foundation, really important voice in this space, in this sector. And of course, you know Alexis Abramson, the Dean of the Columbia Climate School. We're hoping to be joined by a colleague, Richard Mayungi, who's the chair of the African Group of Negotiators. It is COP. There are negotiations going on, so we know that schedules can be very variable. So, Avi, why don't I start with you? And you know, you were an early voice with us in thinking about climate finance vulnerability. And really, I think a lot of this project on the index that we developed was seeded from a lot of questions that you had. Let me ask you, what are the most critical needs for financing climate adaptation? And are there lessons from other aspects of climate financing that could be helpful as we work through this COP?
Thank you very much, Jeff. And let me thank you and Columbia for the great work you've been doing in the space of climate and recently on climate adaptation. Climate is a very fluid space. And so the adaptation question has changed in the past 10 years. Say 10, 15 years ago, we didn't think we could actually adapt to some of the changing climate. And so our focus was on mitigation, and because all bets are off. And then we found that actually we can build for resilience, that climate change is here and happening, not future. We are approaching, slipping over, sadly, regrettably, the 1.5 degrees of warming. We need to pull that back. But that has led to an intensification of climate. It means, for example, that climate is no longer insurable. Insurable risks are risks that are big but infrequent. I can use time to spread that risk across. Now, once in a 1,000-year events are happening once every 10 years, once every 5 years. And so we don't have time anymore. And they're no longer uncertain, so we can't spread across other risks. But we can build for resilience. And the research is showing, some of the work you've done, some of the work that WRI have done, is showing that $1 spent on public infrastructure, resilient public infrastructure, can yield savings of $10. That is therefore tells you, screams at you as to what we need to be doing. We need to be investing in public infrastructure. That's where the leverage is. There's other things we can do, but that's where the leverage is. People say to me, oh, we must get the private sector to fund this. Well, the point about public infrastructure is it's a public good. And so we actually need public finance. You can't have a finance strategy which is the private sector financing public goods. So we need more public finance to low cost, long term, to allow governments to bring forward their investments in resilience on public infrastructure. MDBs play a critical role in that. We can leverage that. We know that the climate vulnerable countries are also heavily indebted because they're climate vulnerable. So we need some non-debt instruments too, like debt swaps. And the final point I'd make is we need to transform this architecture, because if adaptation is something we have to do more of, there's going to be more debt. Whatever we say about it, there's going to be more debt. So how do we live in a world of more debt? We need more flexible debt. We need more pause clauses, more adjustments to debt to make it able to shock absorb the climate shocks we're seeing. Let me stop there.
No, the really, really great insights, and we appreciate your all of this as well as your leadership in this space. Turning now to philanthropy and the Rockefeller Foundation, Elizabeth, the Rockefeller has a tremendous history in resilience building and in this space of community action. And I'm curious from your perspective, more broadly, how you see the role of philanthropy in climate adaptation finance, but also what are you doing with at the Rockefeller Foundation to continue the great work you've been a part of?
Happy to. Oh, good. Okay. Sometimes the mics work, sometimes they don't, so I'm glad you can hear me. And I first of all, Alexis and Jeff, thank you so much for the Columbia Climate School's leadership. I think if you generate so much research evidence, it helps inspire us and helps us take action with credibility. So I don't think we would do any of this if it weren't for the strength of the academic sector to help power that. So thank you. The foundation's been around for 113 years, which means that we actually have a lot of lessons learned. And one of the things that we've been very focused on since our founding is the well-being of humanity. That's been at the core of everything we do, and it is the lens through which we decide what we do. And so when we took a look and we saw that we'd made really good progress as a planet on poverty until about 2015, and we looked at where we make grants, which is 80% in emerging markets, we realized that climate had to form the core of where we focused and what we did, because the communities that we are trying to support, the development, the global development that we are trying to do, is deeply challenged and the most because of the climate challenges. And so the Climate Vulnerability Index, I think, is very helpful because it helps us make sure that when you can't separate climate mitigation from adaptation. The two are inextricably combined. And if we don't actually think about climate adaptation, we're actually not delivering on the development outcomes that we want and we need to have a just and peaceful planet. And so I think when we look at climate adaptation finance, which is a really important part of all of this, it's great to see ClimateWorks just published a report, I think yesterday or a couple days ago, that actually showed that less than 10% of climate finance is happening in adaptation. The good news, though, is a lot more philanthropies are focusing on adaptation as a core part of their progress. And they're looking at how and acknowledging that if they're going to put dollars out in the world, we need to solve people problems at the core of it while delivering on the planetary outcomes. And I want to give you one example of something we're doing, Jeff. So one of the things that we've been working on since the beginning of the foundation is food systems. And we see an incredible opportunity in the fact that 500 million children around the world, at least, rely on school meals as a core part of how they get nutrition. And at the same time, school meals represent, in most government budgets, about 70% of their food budget funding. That's a real lever for change. It can deliver food systems transformation. It can create nutrition security for kids. And when we actually look at some of the modeling that can come from it, it can generate 7 to 35 times return because you're improving kids' lives, kids' education, and the future healthcare of a country because you're actually building more healthy, more resilient kids while delivering better farmer livelihoods, better landscape and food systems and nutrition outcomes. And so that's how we're thinking about how we invest. We want to drive both at the same time because our dollars really have to be as catalytic as they can be to deliver a better future.
I love that example. And so my center, the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at the Climate School, was founded by a pediatrician and children's advocate. We do a lot of work on children. And one of the things we find is exactly what you're describing. If we focus on children and work backwards, we get the whole community, we build resilience, we get very responsive to the need, not to the politics, right? And it becomes this great equalizer. I absolutely love that. Avi, I want to come back to you before you have to run. But if you do stay, I promise I have lots more questions for you too. But I want to get at least one more sort of in light of these discussions too, of kind of balancing maybe some of this perceived competition between development and adaptation, and recognizing there are synergies, and also looking that we have a week and a half of COP to go. What would be the most valuable that you would see to come out of COP, to come out of the next couple of weeks here towards furthering this goal of impactful climate adaptation financing?
Well, we need to see much greater ambition on adaptation, some hard numbers. So the MDBs announced yesterday that we're investing $26 billion a year in adaptation on low and middle income countries. I think we're on track for $42 billion by 2030. We've also, the rating agencies have announced that with all the work on the Bridgetown Initiative and other things to push the CAF reforms, the lending headroom of MDBs has increased by $500 billion. So we need shareholders to say, give priority in that $500 billion of new lending, give priority for long-term, low-cost borrowing for adaptation and building resilience, new technologies to help building resilience. It's great to have grants where you can. We've just launching 55 heat-ready schools in Para State, launching that tomorrow. And that's been helped out by some donor money paying for the incremental bit of resilience. But because resilience and adaptation generate so much returns, I actually think that that should be something owned by the public and multilateral development banks, and that very scarce grant resources are focused on those things that can't be funded any other way, which is actually not adaptation, but loss and damage. So we need to focus those scarce resources on loss and damage, and where it can help on adaptation, yes. But let's get the low-cost, long-term lenders really prioritizing and owning that space, especially for low and middle-income countries. And one of the point of the work you've been doing is that there are countries that appear on paper to have relatively high GDP per capita, but they're extremely, that GDP per capita figure is supposed to reflect wealth, but it can be very fragile. I got involved in climate when Dominica got hit in 2017 and lost 226% of its GDP in 4 hours. So its GDP per capita was irrelevant, really, to that story. So we also need to focus our money as much as we can on low-income countries, but also on highly vulnerable countries. And so we need data like the ones you're producing to help us identify and to help buy them more allocation of finance.
These are really great. I love how much the conversation over the past years has gotten into these very specific mechanisms and balancing these mechanisms. I know GDP per capita is one we look at a lot. I always think of something my mom told me when I was younger. She said, rich people don't have more money, they just have higher monthly payments. I'm not sure that's objectively true, but a shout out to Mom. Yeah. So with all of this, we're seeing a layering of different financial instruments, a layering of different civil society stakeholders, and so we need conveners to do that. Youssef, coming from UNFCCC, right? A lot of the work you do is to really sit at the intersection of all of this, and really to help integrate different stakeholders, different agendas, dare I say, different personalities, all towards trying to harmonize towards a greater good and to move forward. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about kind of the role of the UNFCCC and the work that you're doing in the climate finance space.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jeff, and thanks to Colombia for convening us here and for all the good work you've been doing. I mean, just tracing the evolution of the adaptation story and the finance story, I'm sad Richard isn't here yet, because the first ever workshop we had on adaptation and support for adaptation was in 1999. The only two people in this room that attended that would have been me and Richard. And the story has changed so much. So back then, when we talked about means of implementation, it was finance, technology, and insurance. The insurance story has disappeared from the discourse. And I think it was very heavy back then because of the element of uncertainty. Whenever you talked about impacts, it was, it's very uncertain. There's very little we can do, depend on insurance better. Now, there was only the financial mechanism of the convention that gave money for any climate action at the time, very little bilaterals, very little multilateral support. And the context, the mindset was one of altruism. I think we're starting to depart from that at this point. We have a multitude of entrants into this story. The philanthropies are advancing very rapidly on this. Many funds under the process and outside the process are in there, but what we have is, I think, a salad rather than a soup. There's many things going in many directions and no overarching umbrella, even a virtual one, to show what is most appropriate for what. One thing Avi and I usually disagree on is the notion that much of the extra money that's needed for adaptation has to come from loans. So I'm saying, okay, that's instead of killing people through climate change, you kill them through economic strangulation. And what we need is a new thinking of creative financial instruments that complement grants and loans, which I think will not be expanding much more than they are now. But there's a lot of creative thinking in terms of financial engineering, trying to internalize externalities using blending, using new types of bonds, etc. But no overarching thinking of how do you incorporate that into the mosaic of funds. And that's what we try to do here. It's a mess at this point in time because things evolved organically. Even the financial mechanism of the convention evolved organically in response to preferences of one presidency of a COP or another. Or if you were to invent it today, it would look very different. But we're stuck with it, and we have the new entrants, private sector engagement as well, opportunities for profit that are not being catalyzed, they're not being incentivized. There's de-risking opportunities. You could have private-public partnerships. So what the COP should be doing is mandate the intellectual additional value that would basically map what belongs to what, basically. There's the other question. Avi mentioned loss and damage. The optimization between what needs to be done preemptively, risk reduction, versus what needs to be done reactively. Yes, $1 can save 10 afterwards. So the first billion will save you 10 billion. What about the second billion? Is it another 10 billion? And the third one? There is an optimization story here that is totally lost on the thinkers, which we have to work on. What's done preemptively, what's a contingent action, what's acceptable loss, but to do it in a rigorous process. Something else that we have to push here. It's coming through the National Adaptation Plan process. But yeah, there's a lot of, I think, synergy that needs to be explored between all the partners, especially that this year in particular, there's a lot of new people coming in and offering more money, particularly from the philanthropy side.
No, wonderful, yeah. I always appreciate just, and I know you mentioned this kind of, the first billion saves 10, what about the next? And some of the work that I've done too is okay, whose $1 and whose $10 is saved, right? And sometimes it's not the person asked to pay the dollar, it's more of a societal benefit. How do we reconcile that? Which I think are really important sort of convening points on all of this. You know, with such complex issues, constantly evolving, as you mentioned, sort of working off legacy structures, building new ones, it feels like there's a need for a lot of research and education. Alexis, I'm looking in your direction on this. Alexis, I wonder if you could talk, obviously higher ed is a major factor in this in terms of generating knowledge, in terms of transferring knowledge. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what the Climate School is doing for future leaders, current leaders, information support, and if that's not enough, also maybe kind of the role of higher education more broadly in such a global challenge.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, and such great comments. So thank you for contributing in that way. I think obviously there are many sectors that are going to have to play a role in this very complex problem. Higher education, we typically do two things. We educate and we do research. The Climate School, we're setting off, we're entering we're a new school, we're sort of moving past a pilot phase into really an impact phase, and really are focused on kind of that third leg of the stool as well, which is impact. So at the Climate School, we have faculty, we have academic programs that do, so we do teaching, research, and impact. And so it is so core to what we do, and I think at a moment like we're facing right now, higher education coming with a lot of expertise, helping to explore a lot of the things that Yusuf was mentioning, in particular, optimization around which dollar goes where, essentially, that we can contribute, and that we have a responsibility in higher education to not just publish papers, but to actually get as engaged as we can in seeing the next 5, 10, and 20 years forward as we navigate this very global challenge that we have. So I think also what that requires is a lot of multidisciplinary participation. Just hearing the comments today, right, makes me think, well, we need scientists and engineers thinking about the technologies, the mitigation side. We need policymakers and policy experts, of course. We need business people and financiers and people with that kind of lens. And we need them speaking the same language. I mean that sort of metaphorically, and we need them sort of under one umbrella, so that we're not just bringing them to the table here and there, but actually they're living, breathing together as we work through these problems together and try to find the best solutions moving forward. So the climate school is quite multidisciplinary. You know, usually schools are disciplinary. They have an engineering discipline or a journalism discipline. We have faculty from business, from policy, from science and engineering, communications. We have a historian on our faculty, anthropologists. So being under one roof is really important to addressing this challenge. And I'll just end by mentioning our academic programs too, particularly our master's programs are also quite multidisciplinary. So we have 3 master's programs, an MA in climate and society, an MS in climate, which is a lot of dual degree opportunities with global institutions and with other schools at Columbia. And then this fall, we just launched an MS in climate finance. And so across all of those programs, the students are getting a very core, they're in core courses together, understanding what is climate, what is mitigation, what is adaptation, how are analytics helpful, understanding that, and then they go off sort of into their areas, and in this case, climate finance, to get sort of key finance training, but again, with this lens of climate, so that when they graduate, they can go out and really participate in very meaningful ways to help us sort of accelerate those climate finance solutions.
Yeah, I have the privilege of teaching in the program, and one of the courses I teach this semester, actually I think I'm supposed to be in class right now. Don't
You're
tell.
excused, Jeff.
Thank you. Is our climate? I co-teach our climate adaptation course, which has all 200 plus students in the school, in the lecture, and then in discussions. And the interdisciplinarity you talk about, we'll hand them a case study that we've done 100 times, and then you'll have someone from a different country or from a different discipline. I always think of it like lighting a stage. Every light illuminates one side and casts a shadow on the other, and we really get to see the whole picture with all these diverse perspectives and develop mechanisms for working across fields, which is very, very invigorating. Liz, coming to you with the Rockefeller Foundation, I know you talked a bit about how the work you're doing, you know, we have this challenge with climate mitigation of reducing emissions and adaptation, and really at its core, protecting lives and livelihoods. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about sort of how you're approaching that, and also are there any like really innovative solutions or surprises or things along the way that you're seeing are really novel approaches worth sharing?
Sure, happy to take that. And to know that you have an MS in climate finance is bringing so much joy to my heart. I am a recovering investment banker who spent about 20 years in energy finance and actually did a lot of renewable deals, of which the rating agencies gave me 0 credit. The investors gave me no pricing premium. And I am so happy to hear that, because I think that fundamental pricing of risk and a deeper understanding of risk, both through a corporate perspective, but also just in general, in terms of, Abhinesh talked about debt. Like, we've got to understand the baseline underlying factors that contribute to it, and it has to be priced into structures. And so that gives me so much joy, and also connects to the point on the Climate Vulnerability Index, because I think, Jeff, that's what we need. We need to understand the climate layers and all of the weather challenges that are happening. And then we actually need to understand the finance challenges and opportunities that go alongside of it, because that's how we need, that's what the systems that we need to change, the policies that we need to change, the things that actually allow many of these countries that don't necessarily have capital markets access to have that access so that they can be able to make progress. I think I know I didn't totally answer your question, but I think that that's a really important opportunity to be able to fix the fundamentals. In terms of how we think about where we focus our time, we spend, I talk to my colleagues a lot about, like, what are our superpowers? We're in a firefight right now, and we should really lean into the places and spaces that we can make the most difference. And so where we see that is in our legacy. It's food systems, it's health systems, and it's energy, because that's what the foundation has done for a long time. And we also very much see the opportunity as it aligns with trying to build better data systems so that we can ultimately drive finance, because that is what one of the challenges is. You can't finance it if you can't measure it. And so, in terms of innovative ways of thinking, one thing that I'm really proud of, and I know this is a theme at this COP, is the socio-bioeconomy. It's a mouthful, but it's exactly what we need to be able to deliver and build a greener planet. And one of the things that the foundation has invested in here in Brazil is a company called Momback, which is looking to build and restore degraded farmland and build jobs for those communities by reforesting those areas of the Amazon that have been deforested because of illegal grazing and other activities or illegal deforestation. And it's that blend of us putting in capital. We put $5 million of risk capital into a $100 million capital stack to be able to get that Momback deal done, which is now generating real reforestation credits, using the data so that we're actually having quality surveillance and we know how are the trees, how is the species, what's actually going on. And that enables people like Microsoft, like Google, who are going to be doing their work anyway. It gives them the high integrity carbon credits that they want to buy, and that also then ultimately generates incomes and opportunity for people on the ground to keep doing the work that they're doing. And so we want to keep supporting those kinds of solutions and using our capital not just as grant capital, but as de-risking capital, as catalytic capital, some of the guarantees and insurance type things that need to happen, because that is the privilege that we have as a philanthropy.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. And it's very exciting to hear. In some of the work I do at the Climate School is our executive education programming. And one of the biggest areas of growth and the request we've been getting has been in biodiversity from financial institutions. We have some great faculty with expertise in this and all along these lines. So this seems
Might have to come take a class.
I was just going to say, if you want to take a year off, the application period is now open for our MS in climate finance. Your profile seems like it might be a good fit. No, but thank you for the kind words on the program, too. We're extraordinarily excited about it, and bringing these perspectives together just adds so much. Youssef, I'd like to come back to you in terms of really living at the intersection of so many different perspectives. And from your work with UNFCCC, with regards to climate adaptation finance, where are the areas where you're seeing a lot of traction right now, a lot of momentum building, and maybe the inverse of that, maybe where are some areas that are a little tougher that you're kind of hoping to break through on?
I think the areas with traction, especially comparing to where we were before, definitely the priority being given to adaptation at this point. I mean, you've heard in the opening of this COP, the president of the COP saying this has to be an adaptation COP. And so we've gone a long way from when adaptation was a bad word back in the early 90s to now where you have parity in terms of priority. We're still not there in terms of amount of finance or even accessibility. So the political momentum on adaptation has increased considerably, and that's very helpful. And then the number of stakeholders that are getting involved, whether in providing support or technical input or investments, etc. Now, where we still have a way to go is support for the last mile. much of the money that comes from the financial mechanism goes to central governments. You'll find, I've been in so many talks in the past few weeks where much of the priorities of different sectors, they tell you we only get 1% of total finance. The health people say that. The gender people say we get 0.01%. The subnationals say we get less than 10%. I'm wondering where is all the money going if if all the important stuff isn't getting anything. But to me, it's the people, the front line, the people confronting the hazards that need the most support, and they're not really getting it. It doesn't trickle down automatically. So I think the COP needs a mandate to the financial mechanism and an invitation to everyone that's involved to find ways to reach that bottom level. Another thing that I've started thinking of is there's a lot of context specificness in adaptation that's lost on people. So what's adaptation for one community may be maladaptation for another. The needs may differ. $1 or $1 million in Zambia is not what it means in Switzerland. And so we lump everything together as if it makes sense. I take a cue from how science parks work in the US, Silicon Valley, Route 128, and we need micro science parks at community level where you integrate the work of business, academia, and government together to find context-specific solutions to advance. Without merging these different perspectives, it's very difficult for desk studies to get the right type of priorities for specific communities. It has to be decentralized at that level, and we're not there yet. So that's an area where I think we're highly deficient.
Yeah, no, great points. I'm feeling like very, very energized, and I'm 75% sure it's from the conversation and not this cup of coffee I just finished off sitting down by my feet. Let me, I think you touched on this a bit in terms of different community dynamics. We've sort of touched on different politics. And politics is always part of the ecosystem, right, that we work within. It's very cyclical. Things can swing one way to another. We're in an intensely polarizing moment right now. And I'm just curious, maybe from each of you, sort of how does this impact what you do? How does it, how do you navigate this environment and create the most effective approach possible with respect to the political ecosystem that we're all working within?
I can go first. So obviously being in higher education, the more sort of direct impact that everybody is feeling is on research and research funding and research support. So we have had cuts from the US federal government for some grants that were climate related, and we anticipate that given the likely priorities of the federal government moving forward in the US, that our research support will not be as significant as it has in the past. Now, where our faculty are incredibly bright and also quite nimble. They have a great scientific foundation or policy foundation, and they're, our folks who do work on flooding, for example, they just talk about their work on flooding and they leave some other terms out that might rub people the wrong way. So there's some creative solutions out there. But unfortunately, there is that significant impact. With that said, I continue to be incredibly optimistic about the progress that we're making and that we can make even in the face of some of the political challenges that we face. What a lot of people don't necessarily know about the United States is, of course, the federal government plays a strong role in policy setting, in research and things along those lines that affect us nationally. We also have quite a bit of autonomy as states and cities in the US. And as a result, New York City, where I am currently, where Columbia is, right, we're moving full steam ahead with a lot of the climate mitigation and climate adaptation strategies that have been planned and are moving forward. I work in the building energy efficiency area, lots of activity to try to retrofit buildings. There's a lot around vehicle transportation, electric vehicle infrastructure, things along those lines are continuing to move forward, and Columbia, as a partner to those institutions locally, continue to play a significant role in that. And in addition, one other thing I'll mention is that people often ask me, well, are applications down as a result from students? And I would say our applications have never been higher. That there are students, I know many here at COP as well, who have embraced this moment, have sort of recommitted to their dedication to fighting climate change and its impact, and want to do more, ever more, to really kind of engage in various ways. So that's wonderful to see. And even in partnerships with industry and philanthropies and other governments, just seeing a lot of momentum there. So we're at a time of uncertainty. I think we'll still be in that time of uncertainty. But I will say across our partners, across our students, there's a lot of hope and optimism and commitment.
I'd love to just offer three things. I think one is that's tremendous. We've seen sort of as an American, a step back from climate. We're glad to see Gavin Newsom here representing. I think one of the things that we've also learned through our work is we did some polling early on climate, and it was great to see that 36,000 people, I think, said, hey, by the way, this is something that we care about. Keep going, keep driving. And we've been trying to understand what and how we can build that narrative. And so as we've done our strategies of of the areas that we focus, I call it the club sandwich, which is a very American term.
I love a club sandwich.
Yeah, okay. Well, this is our club sandwich. So we're thinking, look, we've got to hit the national level. And so because that is where policy formation really starts. We've got to think about the subnational level and cities, counties, states. And then we also need to make sure that that base layer, the thing that actually holds the sandwich together, the people, the communities, are a core part of what informs how we do our work. And I offer that up because I think about, the last piece of it, which is partnerships. So one of the things that we're doing as part of our health portfolio is a real focus on heat. And I think everyone here in this room understands firsthand why we need to focus on heat right now. What I want to offer you this statistic because one thing that really sits in my mind is that 1 person a minute dies from extreme heat. We lose almost $1 trillion last year because of extreme heat. That is a lot of work hours. But we cannot actually solve that if we don't listen to the communities that are affected by it and the farmers who tell me, I don't know when to grow my crops, or the people and the women workers who say, I can't work outside because it's too hot, and that means I can't bring a livelihood home to my family. And so we're grateful to be working with Wellcome Trust and a number of other partners on the topic of heat. We're working with a lot of mayors in 33 cities across, I think, 24 different countries to build this cool climate accelerator in C40 to make sure that we're tackling heat in the most prominent areas, urban being the hottest places. And then we're also trying to support national governments to understand how and where those heat issues are happening, where we're building early warning systems to make sure that they have the capacity and ability to communicate with their citizens, develop the policies that they need to be able to protect and build cleaner, cooler, and more healthy communities. So that's my club sandwich approach and how we've been really trying to pivot our strategies to make sure that we hit all communities and we really drive permanent change for people.
Absolutely love it. Thank you.
And my approach now is to spread the realization that we're at the end of a narrative and the start of a new one. The whole notion that climate change is merely a developmental issue is passé. It's an existential issue where the principles of economic and business collapse. The whole notion of using cost-benefit analysis, discount rates, all of it does not work. And I'm so glad you guys are doing multidisciplinary work, and perhaps you're even doing extra-disciplinary work that doesn't necessarily belong to a certain label. And so that realization that we have to think very differently and invent new vernacular that possibly doesn't exist, and moving to a well-being economy. It's not just one where, okay, let's do projects that are bankable. Let's look, it's just a very different story where we're talking about human life. Every additional life lost to climate change should be avoided. Just having a smaller loss of life is not acceptable. It should be zero. And welcome to Richard.
Yeah, so welcome, Richard. We're so glad to have you here. I know you're doing the hard work of negotiating, but we're very grateful to have you here at the end. I wonder if you could talk a little bit. You were immersed in the negotiations, immersed in these issues. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about kind of what you're seeing in these discussions, and for the bloc that you represent, what are some of the most important things that you're looking at with regards to climate adaptation and climate adaptation finance specifically?
Thank you very much, and apologies for coming in a bit later. I was on another event equally important. We are discussing the hosting of COP32, and the government of Ethiopia has just been endorsed. So we thought we should be there and support them. So I don't know what you have discussed, so I'll just jump in. But for us, in terms of the focus of our work here, there is nothing which is much more important than adaptation. And I'm saying this because you will say it's finance, means of implementation. Yes, it's finance, means of implementation, but we have gone to a level where we have at least defined how finance should be flowing, much as we have not agreed, but we have the Pavilion roadmap, it's uploaded there. We have an agreement on many aspects in terms of capitalizing the funds. We have the loss and damage fund moving and all those things. But the clarity on how adaptation is going to be given equal importance globally is what we need here. The whole question of the discussions around the GGA and the indicators is how do we take adaptation with equal importance as mitigation. We know under mitigation we have been able to at least agree on a global goal, which is 1.5 degrees. But what do we have as a global goal on adaptation? We know we cannot have a single global goal as we are having in mitigation, but we can have areas of engagement as a global community which will assure the developing countries that indeed we are taking the right approach, the right direction, and we have indicators which can show us that we are going to the right direction. So the discussions here are focusing on how best we can ensure that adaptation is given equal importance, not only because we want to implement the NAPs, which is also important in terms of adaptation, not only because we have these new funds, the loss and damage fund, which is equally important for adaptation, not only because we want to capitalize the existing funds, the adaptation fund, the GCF, et cetera, but how are we going to measure that things are happening? And this is what Yusuf was saying. How do we measure that lives are not lost on a daily basis? How do we measure that ecosystems are becoming resilient? How do we measure that health is an important part of adaptation, et cetera, et cetera? So for us, this is one important opportunity to ensure that we agree on a global goal, but based on indicators we can all measure, we can all use to intervene in all areas we are intervening. So this is our focus. This is the important work we are doing. We are doing many other works around adaptation, but for us here in Belém, this is what we think will be a key outcome of our work here. Thank you.
It's such an important point, and I think a theme we've seen throughout, right, is that there's data that's measured or value that's communicated, but then there's value that's experienced. And that's ultimately what we need to have, right, is that the value of these interventions are something that people are actually experiencing in their lives. In our remaining minutes, I'll ask one final question. Maybe we'll go down. Richard, we'll give you the last word. But ask, so we're a couple of days into COP. We've got about a week and a half left to go for what you're doing for carrying it forward. What are you hoping to see for climate finance? What would be the most helpful thing for you to kind of carry forward in your role to continue to help move things forward for climate adaptation and climate finance? Youssef, sorry, you have the least time to come up with an answer.
Well, I'll have to agree with Richard on this. The most important thing that will unlock finance is operationalizing the global goal on adaptation, being able to properly identify the indicators that measure progress, not versus the past. It's progress towards a landing zone. And that has created a new paradigm in how we think of adaptation. Now we know where we need to be. We can measure how far we are. Then you can quantify what's missing in terms of technical assistance, other types of support, finance, etc. So that, I think, is what I would like out of this COP.
Love it. Yeah, please.
I'm glad to get to go second because that's what I would have said, but at least I'm not going last. So I think pulling on maybe a different theme that we haven't really talked about. I think we need to figure out how to, we always say it at every single turn, but private sector finance, we've got to keep the private sector in the fight. We've got to make sure that they have the space to actually execute. From an RF perspective, that's why we're really leaning on innovative financing mechanisms like the traction work that's happening in Singapore and the coal transition credits, because we know that we need to find alternate forms of finance that are high integrity, that unlock some of the capital that sits on the sideline for adaptation and transition.
Oh, those are two great reflections. I think one thing I would point to from the higher education standpoint is making sure that we're using sort of evidence-based learnings about what's working, what's not working, how we, not every solution is going to be right. I think Yusuf said this in every particular geography, but we can take that evidence, we can understand the correlations, understand the needs, and how do we take that and now apply that to different regions of the world to really find the best practices, to really find the best solutions. I think higher education can play a role in helping, through partnerships, helping to move us along that path maybe a little more quickly.
Richard, take us home.
Well, adaptation finance is a moving target. Actually, it depends on what we do on mitigation, and therefore how we reduce the vulnerability, so how much we need in terms of adaptation finance. It's very difficult for us, actually, even to determine what would be the best levels of adaptation finance, and we have been struggling even in our Standing Committee on Finance to define that. We know there are discussions around tripling, doubling, and all that. There are discussions around what type of finance will go where. But I think what is important is that adaptation finance is needed in various ways and different amounts, but will be determined on how much we do also on mitigation to reduce the vulnerabilities, and the many ways of financing adaptation we all accept because it's national specific, country specific, regional specific, group specific, but we are all equally vulnerable. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, if we keep you here any longer, we're going to have to charge you tuition. So we'll wrap up. But first of all, to all of the panelists, thank you so much for all of your tireless work and leadership in your respective fields on this issue. And also to all of you. You're here attending today because you are a part of this work, a part of carrying it forward. And we're very, very grateful for all that you're doing as well, too. So let's give one final round of applause for everyone. Thank you.